Well, good morning, everyone. How was you guys' respective last nights? Fun? Yeah? Fun. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for making it here. I am so happy today because the sun is shining and it was meant to be raining and we would have not had the view of the Golden Gate Bridge. And I think it's a special place. And I think it, perhaps invites us to lift our gaze a little bit as we get into the more creative parts of this weekend. And so I really, welcome you to show up as people and to take the kind of like task at hand seriously. We're going to be creating existential hope scenarios, but to also treat them somewhat humorously. We will be using GPT-3 and generative AI models. And so I'm hoping that, we can let a bit of our imagination for positive futures fly. But before we get all creative, I want to get actually rather, let's say, pragmatic and practical. And I'm really happy to have Tom Kalil here. And so Tom, I think we've met at a Bill Talks like 6 years ago or something. Who has been to Bill Talks? And you were giving a talk there, and I think Christine and I were too. And afterwards we met up, and I thought that you were like A, super inspiring, but also B, really pragmatic and practical about like what we can actually do, and like rather like concrete in the questions that you were asking. So since then we've had the pleasure of welcoming you at a few Foresight events in the past, and you've obviously been incredibly substantial pushing for A, government innovation, then innovation also at Berkeley, and now really like through Schmidt Futures, you've been doing a fantastic job and have been like a very dear mentor also to our fellows, and have we've had a few sessions with you there. So thanks a lot for all the work that you do. I would love to perhaps start with a brief fireside chat, and if you guys have questions, that's maybe a good time to still get some bits out of the out of your system, and so we're trying to like start on a more practical note before we dive into the more exploratory existential hope sessions. So perhaps you could maybe start us off with saying a few words. I mean, like you've been now really doing philanthropic work with Eric Schmidt for really quite like 6 years, right?
Yeah.
Is it? And perhaps you can tell us a little bit about like what focus areas you have here and like what your approach to innovation has been with Schmidt Futures.
Yeah, so Schmidt Futures is a relatively new philanthropic initiative supported by Eric and Wendy Schmidt and launched in 2017. So there is a major focus on talent. So a lot of the work of Schmidt Futures is supporting cohort-based fellowship programs. So we have something called the Schmidt Science Fellows Program, and that supports people who have gotten a PhD in one discipline but want to do a postdoc in another. There's another program called Technologists for Global Transformation. These are early career computer scientists and engineers who are interested in working on tech for good projects for 2 years. So rather than becoming, an associate product manager at a tech company, they work on fighting gerrymandering and reducing prison recidivism and increasing agricultural productivity in East Africa and improving the public health system. We have a program called our Innovation Fellows Program that is our mid-career program for people who have an idea that I call important if true, and where in addition to giving them some funding, we're also interested in building a broader coalition around their ideas. One program that is, I think, particularly relevant to Foresight is a collaboration with Convergent Research to identify and evaluate and launch focused research organizations. So this started out with some conversations that I had with Adam Marblestone and Sam Rodriguez on a whole class of scientific and technical problems that they said are not a good fit for academia, but are also difficult to do as a venture-backed startup. And Adam was at DeepMind at the time, and he said, I want to spend the next chapter of my career working on this, and I would be willing to leave DeepMind in order to do this. So that was, a reasonably important signal to me that he was excited about the idea. So we gave him a fellowship through the Innovation Fellows Program for a year. He and I interviewed over 100 scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs, and said, imagine that there was this new funding mechanism called a focused research organization. Are there important binding constraints or enablers that would have a transformative impact on your field? And the answer to that turned out to be that there were a lot of ideas. So this was sort of an aha moment that I had, which is researchers were not asking themselves, what would I do if I were the CEO of a $50 million research nonprofit? Because that seemed like an unlikely outcome. In the same way that most people don't say, I'm going to come up with a detailed plan for what I would do if I won the lottery. And so I think a role that philanthropy can play is to identify a question which is generative, that there are lots of good answers, and to increase the expected return from answering that question. So what happened was we had a list of ideas. We briefed Eric on those ideas. He said, pick two. And one of them is being led by Andrew on scalable approaches to brain mapping that leverage advances in areas like expansion microscopy. There's another one called Cultivarium, which is in the field of synthetic biology. And there is a list of 300 ideas. And so that is an example of one of dozens of initiatives that we are supporting at Schmidt Futures.
Yeah, wonderful. Adam, unfortunately, I think got sick.
Yes.
He couldn't make it for this one, but he was here last year, and we've been collaborating with him and also Ben, with speculative technologies. I don't know if Ben is here already. But there's been a few really interesting, just like new innovative approaches in funding. And I think that, I do believe that people don't really often ask themselves that question, which is a nice one. And I welcome all of you guys to ask yourself that question too. Like, what would you do if you were the head of a $50 million research nonprofit? I think that's a fun, it's a fun train of thought. And perhaps you submit something to Tom. Okay, perhaps, that is one of the kind of like meta layers in which you in which you really like support innovation. Another one is like really this marketplace for outcome idea, which is like still relatively nascent, but perhaps you could tickle people's minds a bit.
So as Evan talked about, there are certain types of things that the market does a great job of solving, and other things that it doesn't do a good job solving. So a canonical example is vaccines for diseases of the poor. If you woke up and discovered that you were the CEO of a pharmaceutical company, and you went to your board and you said, I want to work on a vaccine for diseases of the poor, for people who are living on $2 a day. Your board would say, what the hell, this is crazy talk. Like, why would you do that? So Michael Kramer, who recently won the Nobel Prize in Economics, came up with a clever hack for solving this problem, which is a purchase order for a product that doesn't exist yet. So as a result of his work, 5 countries in the Gates Foundation went to GSK and Pfizer and said, if you develop a vaccine for pneumococcal diseases, we will provide a copay of X dollars per vaccine for this many million vaccines. And then after that, we want you to make it available at close to its marginal cost. And that one intervention saved the lives of 700,000 poor kids in developing countries. Similarly, when the United States retired the space shuttle, the US government had to give the Russians $50 million per astronaut, per ticket, every time we wanted to send an astronaut to the International Space Station. So that was obviously not a great position for the US to be in. So NASA said to SpaceX, if you develop a rocket that can go to the International Space Station and deliver and retrieve cargo and ultimately astronauts, not only will we buy rides on the rocket, but we will also provide you with milestone payments for intermediate progress towards that goal. And that allowed NASA to get a capability, the Falcon 9, for a fraction of what they have spent on cost plus government contracts to incumbent defense and aerospace companies. Operation Warp Speed. Pfizer did not take any R&D money from the government. all the Operation Warp Speed had to do to Pfizer is to say, if you get a emergency use authorization from the FDA, we will buy 300 million doses. Huh. So some work that I did for President Clinton was to get DARPA prize authority, which they used for the first self-driving car competition. The first time they ran it, no one won. The second time they ran it, Sebastian Thrun's team at Stanford won. Larry Page was at the finish line, and he promptly acquired the winning team. So that's where X and Waymo came from. When I came back into government, I was able to work with the Senate to get every agency prize authority for up to $50 million. So if you go to challenge.gov, you'll see hundreds of instances in which the agencies are beginning to use this authority. But it's still very much the exception as opposed to the rule. So if you look at the balance sheet of the federal government, you will see the US government making many financial commitments that are contingent on failure. And those are loan guarantees. So what is that? That is the government saying if that individual or firm goes bankrupt, then the US government will assume those debt obligations. We are barely scratching the surface on our ability to make financial commitments that are contingent on success, which seems really perverse to me. So what I would like to see before I retire is a marketplace for outcomes that has 4 types of participants. The sponsor of the outcome, the entity that is willing to pay, like NASA in the case of the Falcon 9, or Operation Warp Speed in the case of the mRNA vaccines. The second are the teams that believe that they can achieve that. The third is the investors, either philanthropic or commercial, who are backing those teams. And the fourth is the subject matter experts who are coming up with the performance-based descriptions of what would constitute progress in a particular domain and the contracts. Because there are advanced market commitments, there are milestone payments for intermediate progress, there are volume guarantees, there are incentive prizes, there are contract for differences, there is pooled procurement, there are all these other mechanisms that are not trying to affect the supply of innovation through grants and contracts. They're trying to affect the demand for innovation. And so that is one of the things that I'm interested in. And what I think is very interesting is that there are some ideas that the global health community has developed that have not moved outside of that field. And what are those ideas? There are 1 million newborns who die every year, mostly in developing countries. And most of those newborn deaths are from easily preventable diseases. For each of those conditions that are responsible for the majority of those deaths, UNICEF and Rice University has created something called a target product profile. It's a performance-based description of a low-cost, rugged medical device that would reduce those newborn deaths. So now, if you're, let's say you had like an exit because you sold your enterprise SaaS company, and you want to do something to improve the human condition, you can now look at this document and it will tell you exactly what the device needs to be, not how to build it, but what its performance characteristics need to be in order to reduce newborn deaths in sub-Saharan Africa and other low resource settings. So that is the marketplace that I would like to see. Now, Evan and his colleagues have some other ideas, which I think are really interesting, which is you don't know upfront what it is that you want, right? And you just want to, in general, have retroactive funding. And I think that's another idea that I think is worth pursuing. But I think in some other areas, we have at least a reasonably strong hypothesis of the innovation that we would like to see that solves some important problem. And what we need to do is, motivate researchers and entrepreneurs to solve these problems.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, there's a ton of innovation that you guys have been doing, and if you're interested in hypercerts, impact certificates, and so forth, that's a good one. Evan is a good one to talk to there as well. Yeah, very cool. I think maybe I'll just ask one more question, and then I want to open up the space for you. Oh, you already have one? Go for it.
When do you plan to retire?
When do I plan to retire?
I just asked because you mentioned before I
Yeah.
retire, so I wonder what my deadline is.
Yeah. Good question. How about not before 80?
Oh, but he can also make you live younger. So
Yeah.
It's not biological 80 or chronological.
Yeah, no.
It's 28.
Like I'll work longer if you guys deliver on
good incentive. Okay,
Yeah.
you had a question?
I've heard of something called impact bonds, and
Yes.
I think there are markets for impact bonds. So I'm wondering what's the difference between what you're proposing and impact bonds. And then
Yeah.
second question is if you could give an example of how your system would work for something like homelessness in San Francisco.
Yeah, great question. So generally the way impact bonds have been used is to scale up an intervention that already exists, right? So for example, if there's a nonprofit that can reliably reduce prison recidivism, the government will use impact bonds as a mechanism. But these things still haven't really taken off. I think that's the big problem. And one reason is that I think there's a fair amount of inertia, right? The government and philanthropic organizations and foundations are used to a certain way of doing things, and most people are not terribly excited about change. So I think that inertia is important. I don't know the answer to your question about homelessness. I think it's a really good question. Does anyone here know how you would do like pay for outcomes for I mean, it might be I think that you would have to do some stratification. So for example, the intervention that you would have to do for someone who has schizophrenia and is homeless is probably very different from someone who is highly functional and could get a job and just homeless as a result of sort of a string of bad luck.
Oh wow. Okay, we're going to do rapid fire rounds of questions.
This is not a question. I'm just going to address that for a second. It seems to me that it might be best to not start in San Francisco.
Yeah.
You might want to start like where I live. Palm Springs does not have a homeless problem like San Francisco, but it has a homeless problem.
Yeah.
It's kind of isolated, and you could sort of maybe do a small scale trial before
Yes.
you scale up.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it seems to me like most research projects kind of require sort of funding up front. And
Yes.
all these sort of outcomes-based things are about sort of things that come later. So who is kind of in this sort of a setup the person that kind of provides the initial thing and then collects, successful way?
Yeah. So it's a good question. So for example, one of the reasons that AMC has worked for vaccines is that companies like Pfizer could self-finance, right? In the case of the NASA SpaceX collaboration, that's one of the reasons that they used milestone payments, right? So they didn't just say, oh, once you have the rocket, we'll buy it, or we'll buy rides on the rocket. They said, we will provide you with milestone payments for intermediate progress towards that goal. So for precisely the reason that you mentioned, I think that if you are trying to get a new entrant to solve a problem, I think milestone payments may play a really important role.
And the government can make milestone payments credibly. Like it's very credible promise that.
I mean, like not 100%, right? Yeah, I think that they would have to say, an agency would have to say, like, subject to the availability of congressional appropriations.
Okay, we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Evan and then Robin.
Mine was an injection onto how you would do this for homelessness in San Francisco. Either a private individual or the San Francisco government would say, at this point in the future, we are going to reward work between now and then that has, according to like these guidelines and these individuals as representatives, been deemed the most effective, and the prize will be between this amount and this amount, and it will go to the people who did the work and the people who funded them, and then all the venture capitalists try to find all of the teams that would be successful in this, assuming the prize is significant enough.
Yeah, and you can have an investment marketplace. So as soon as there's some sort of vetting that's done on a team, then some sort of like qualifying, and the same thing with the investors to make sure that they're not nasty people, and they can help fund the teams along the way, especially with the guarantee that there's milestone payments.
Well, I'm glad we're already in brainstorming mode about it. Let's solve this by end of day. Robin.
So what you're talking about sounds a lot like prizes, which, as you know, are an ancient form of funding research. 3 centuries ago, it was actually the dominant form of funding research. And then in the interim, about a century and a half ago, the scientific community coordinated to suppress prizes and replace them with grants, which are now the dominant form of funding. So doesn't that suggest like there's a more fundamental obstacle here than mere ignorance of this alternative, that there's a reason why people don't like it and try to suppress it?
Yeah, and I think the question is, I think that for academic research, I'm not sure that to what extent academics could self-finance if you moved to supporting research on the basis of prizes and these other mechanisms. So I'm not saying that this like replaces all mechanisms for funding research. My view is that it is underutilized. And Jason Matheny and I did a blog post at the end of the Obama administration because he had actually done a side-by-side comparison of the payoff of using prizes for advances in algorithms relative to traditional grants and contracts. And he discovered that IARPA was getting 10 times the value for money using incentive prizes than grants and contracts. So that suggests that there's a lot more upside for using these approaches.
There could be a disalignment between funders and scientists. It could be great for funders, but be terrible for scientists.
Yeah.
Sounds like a union, right?
Troublesome, yeah.
There's probably a political economy issue here that is relevant.
There's an interesting new post on
Oh, Nick.
Yeah, it seems like there might be a missing element that could be helpful.
Yes.
Mechanism design, which is the notion of like having kind of cooperative sandboxes where you, instead of each individual team is competing for this prize, there is some prize money at the end. There's some grant money up front, and you have 3 or 4 different teams that, they have their separate hypotheses, and they kind of want their hypothesis to win.
Right.
But when they're in this collective sandbox, they're competing, but they're also sharing out their results, and everyone's learning together. And no matter what, the funder and that community are going to get the omni win, or there's an incredibly high probability that they're going to get the omni win that amongst their sandbox they will find the solution.
I mean, just to double down on that point, if you talk to people in the self-driving car industry, a very large number of them got to know each other by virtue of participating in the competition.
Yeah, we also had a Maps hackathon, Evan and us, on creating a better tech tree tool with a few others. And I think at the beginning, people were like competing. And then at the end, in our office hours, they're like, okay, let's now start collaborating. And in the end, it was like more of a collaborative process, but people got like together, like almost to create the common knowledge like through the prize. And then once they were in the basin, like then it was actually better for them to work together.
Can I just make one, I know we're wrapping up, but I wanted to make one point that I don't think that the research community has like fully internalized, which is that there are now 2,000 families who have $500 million or more in wealth. And their average level of philanthropy is 1.2%. So if you make the modest assumption that they're doing as well as an index fund, they could be dramatically increasing their philanthropy with no net reduction in their wealth. So many of them are seeing their wealth go up despite having signed a letter that said they're going to give half of their wealth away. You see a range of organizational responses to people who have this money. And on one end, you have the, Bill Gates, Chan Zuckerberg organizational response, which is they go out and they hire a large professional staff. And they say, like, go make progress on, global health and global development, et cetera, et cetera. The other, though, is there are people who have tens of billions of dollars in wealth and one liberal arts major for a philanthropic advisor. That constrains their ability to source and evaluate S&T related ideas. So what does this mean for the research community? when these people have unmediated access to the research community, any one individual researcher will say, ooh, you should fund my lab. And to the extent that they interact with universities, the university will say, you should build us a building and we'll put your name on it. Or you should endow our college and we'll put your name on it. Neither of those, it strikes me, are particularly creative. And so what I think these people would really benefit from is the type of agenda setting that researchers will sometimes do in workshops, which is to say, for a given problem or for an emerging area of research that we think is underfunded relative to its importance, what are the opportunities? So in other words, the agenda setting associated with being able to answer the question, where are we now, where do we want to be, and how are we going to get there? So for example, we had a researcher from the Baker lab who came to us, and she didn't say, fund my lab. She said, I believe that my field is at a tipping point with respect to the adoption of automation. And if you gave me a relatively small amount of money, I could get the top 10 protein engineering labs in the US to adopt cloud labs. And that would increase the amount of time that young researchers can spend on experimental design as opposed to pipetting, to increase the reliability of data, to take protocols that are right now can only be done in one lab and make them available to the entire research community, and to generate on demand the data that is needed to train machine learning models for prediction, not just of protein structure, which we can do with AlphaFold 2, but for protein function, like protein-protein binding. And so that was a more compelling thing than Fund My Lab. That was, I'm looking at the field as a whole, and I've identified this leverage point, and this is my hypothesis about why this investment in this area would be transformational. So that role, until someone gives me a better name, I'm calling the field strategist. So if there are people who are willing to do that, then the expected return from that agenda setting has gone way up. Because now, as opposed to just a handful of science agencies, there are literally thousands of people who could fund these mid-scale projects. So that's the opportunity that I don't think the research community is A, fully aware of, and B, recognizing that the potential payoff from this type of agenda setting has gone up in a pretty dramatic way.
Yeah, I think that's also, definitely for us that resonates for producing the tech trees, in the sense that I think oftentimes, we have lots of folks that come to me and they're like, okay, what could I do to help move longevity forward? I'm like, I don't know. But then when you ask others, they're like, well, fund my company, fund my lab. And I think that like by mapping out the space a bit and creating like a few also challenge points that are a bit broader than like the field or like.
Yeah, so for example, I've been talking to one of the things that Martin and his longevity apprentices have been working on is what would we need to do differently than we are currently doing today to accelerate the discovery and validation of biomarkers that could be used to guide the research field, but ultimately relied on as surrogate endpoints for the approval of geroprotective therapies. So that's an example of a question. Another one is, what's the incremental investment that we could make on clinical trials that are right now at the design stage but have not been launched that would increase their value to the longevity field? So that's what I'm interested in is how do we, in addition to general excitement about the future, how do we identify concrete initiatives that will accelerate progress? And what is the coalition of the willing and able that we need to build? So the question that I used to pose to people when I worked for President Obama was, you have a meeting with the president in the Oval Office, and he says, Allison, if you give me a good idea for advancing existential hope, then I will call anyone on the planet, It can be a conference call, so there can be more than one person on the line. If it's someone inside the government, I can direct them to do something because I'm their boss. If it's someone outside, like a philanthropist or the CEO of a company or the head of a scientific society, I can challenge them to do something. And Allison, all you have to do is tell me the answer to 2 questions. Who should I call and what should I ask them to do?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really, really nice mental model for when we are now moving into the existential hope scenarios. You will be discussing these bits and pieces of where are we today, what's the positive future and negative future, and those would be the formations for creating the X-Hope scenarios. But let's also think a bit about the change, and let's make it a bit practical. If this comes up already in your discussions, that'd be wonderful. I think this is ultimately the lever that we can pull, and perhaps you keep Tom's phrasing in mind for that.
And
who to call and what to tell them.
For the top N ideas, I will do office hours and play 20 questions with the authors until we have identified the Ocean's 11 that needs to come together to make these scenarios happen.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom.